Spinoza explains what America cannot see. The war Americans no longer want. There is a strange silence at the center of every war. It is not the silence that follows an explosion. It is not the silence inside a home when a family receives terrible news. It is not even the silence of soldiers waiting in darkness for the next attack. It is the silence between what a government says it is protecting and what its people are actually losing. America has been told that the war with Iran is about security. It has been described as a struggle to prevent nuclear catastrophe, defend American forces, protect strategic allies, preserve the credibility of the United States, and stop a dangerous regime from reshaping the Middle East. Each of these claims carries emotional weight. Each can be connected to a legitimate fear. And that is precisely why this moment demands more than outrage, loyalty, or partisan reflex. It demands something far more difficult. It demands thought. The conflict that began on February 28 has now entered its fifth month. Missile strikes have crossed borders. American positions and regional allies have been targeted. The United States has answered with attacks against Iranian military infrastructure. Shipping routes, oil facilities, and regional economies have been placed under growing pressure. Yet inside the United States, something important has changed. The public mood is turning. A recent national survey found that approximately 2/3 of American adults no longer believe the war has been worth fighting. Approval of President Donald Trump's handling of Iran has fallen. Concerns about gasoline prices and the domestic economic consequences of the conflict now compete with, and in some cases, exceed concerns about Iran's nuclear ambitions. Congress is also showing signs of resistance. On July 23, the House of Representatives voted 214 to 208 to direct President Trump to stop military action against Iran unless he first obtained congressional authorization. A week later, on July 30, a similar attempt in the Senate failed by only one vote, 49 to 50. The numbers reveal a profound contradiction. Millions of Americans want the fighting reduced or stopped. Members of both political parties are questioning whether the president possesses the authority to continue it. The financial burden is becoming harder to ignore. The strategic objective remains uncertain, and still, the machinery of war continues. This is not merely a political problem. It is a philosophical problem. How does a nation continue a war that much of its population no longer wants? How does temporary emergency power become permanent executive authority? How can citizens who deeply value freedom become willing to surrender oversight, debate, and constitutional restraint? And why do people sometimes defend the very political forces that make them more frightened, less secure, and less free? Nearly 4 centuries ago, Baruch Spinoza confronted these questions. He did not know Donald Trump. He did not know the Islamic Republic of Iran. He never saw a ballistic missile, a television news network, a presidential social media account, or an algorithm capable of spreading panic to millions of people within seconds. But Spinoza understood something about political power that remains dangerously relevant. He understood that fear is never merely an emotion experienced by individuals. Fear can become an institution. It can become a language. It can become a method of government. It can enter churches, parliaments, newsrooms, and family conversations. It can determine which questions are permitted and which doubts are condemned. It can transform obedience into patriotism and make critical thought appear almost treasonous. Spinoza's warning was not that every threat is imaginary. Iran presents real strategic dangers. Its government has supported armed groups, suppressed internal opposition, restricted information, and pursued policies that have alarmed neighboring states and Western governments. American officials have genuine responsibilities to protect citizens, military personnel, and allies. But acknowledging danger is not the same as surrendering reason. Spinoza would ask a more disturbing question. What happens when a real danger is surrounded by so much fear that the public can no longer judge it clearly? What happens when citizens are told that hesitation invites catastrophe, that debate strengthens the enemy, and that constitutional restraints must wait until the emergency has passed? And what happens when the emergency never passes? This is the question America cannot avoid. The greatest weapon in this war may not be a missile. It may be fear itself, not because fear invented the conflict, but because fear may now be sustaining it. Trump, Iran, and the return of permanent war. Every war begins with a promise of limitation. The military action will be precise. The mission will be brief. The objective will be clear. The enemy will be weakened. The danger will be contained. The troops will return. The economy will absorb the cost. Normal life will soon resume. But history repeatedly teaches another lesson. Wars rarely remain confined to the language used to begin them. A limited strike becomes a campaign. A campaign becomes a commitment. A commitment becomes a test of national credibility. And once credibility is invoked, withdrawal is no longer presented as a strategic choice. It is presented as humiliation. This is how nations become trapped, not necessarily because their leaders planned an endless war from the beginning, but because every stage creates a political reason to continue. The first attack must be defended. The first casualty must be given meaning. The first retaliation must be answered. The first failure must be corrected. The first escalation must not appear to have been wasted. Eventually, the original question disappears. The nation stops asking, "Should we enter this war?" It begins asking, "How can we leave without appearing weak?" These are not the same question, and they do not produce the same decisions. President Trump has built much of his political identity around strength. His language is direct, confrontational, and deliberately resistant to ambiguity. He speaks of winning, dominance, surrender, deterrence, and respect. To his supporters, this style communicates resolve. It rejects the cautious vocabulary of diplomats and technocrats. It promises that America will no longer hesitate before its enemies. But political strength can become a dangerous performance. Once a leader's public image depends on never retreating, every diplomatic compromise risks appearing like personal defeat. Every negotiated settlement may be described by opponents as surrender. Every concession can threaten the mythology on which leadership has been built. The conflict then becomes more than a confrontation between states. It becomes a confrontation between the president and the possibility of appearing weak. This does not mean every military decision is driven by ego. National security decisions emerge from intelligence assessments, military planning, alliances, domestic pressures, and changing events on the ground. But leaders do not operate outside psychology. They are human beings who inhabit political identities. They know that millions of people are watching. They know that allies are measuring their resolve. They know that enemies are searching for hesitation. They know that political opponents are waiting to transform compromise into failure. Under these conditions, war develops its own emotional logic. A strike must be answered because unanswered violence looks like weakness. A threat must be repeated because silence looks like uncertainty. An objective must be expanded because the original objective no longer justifies the cost already paid. The longer the war lasts, the harder it becomes to admit that the promised victory may not be available. This is the logic of permanent war. Permanent war does not require fighting at the same intensity forever. It only requires the nation to remain inside a permanent state of anticipation. Another missile may come. Another terrorist attack may occur. Another facility may be discovered. Another intelligence report may reveal an approaching threat. Another ally may ask for protection. Another provocation may require retaliation. The enemy is never completely defeated because the possibility of danger can never be completely eliminated. That possibility becomes politically useful. A government facing an undefined threat can always claim that exceptional powers remain necessary. Military secrecy must continue. Public scrutiny must be limited. Surveillance must be expanded. Executive flexibility must be protected. Congress must not interfere with operational decisions. Citizens must trust information they are not permitted to see. The public is placed in an impossible position. It is asked to consent without knowledge. It is expected to judge a policy while being told that the most important evidence is classified. It is expected to trust leaders who insist that doubt itself could endanger national security. This is where war begins to transform democracy, not when elections are canceled, not when the Constitution is formally abolished, but when citizens gradually accept that the most consequential decisions are too urgent, too secret, or too complex for democratic restraint. Spinoza would recognize the pattern. He lived in a Europe marked by religious conflict, political violence, censorship, and the struggle between competing authorities. He understood that rulers do not maintain power through force alone. Force can compel the body, but stable power requires influence over imagination. A government is strongest when people do not merely obey its commands, but begin to experience obedience as necessary, moral, and protective. This is why political language matters. Consider the difference between these two statements. We are continuing military operations whose costs, objectives, and legal authority remain contested. And we are defending America from an enemy that understands only strength. The first statement invites examination. The second produces an emotional alignment. It places the listener inside a moral drama. America becomes the defender. Iran becomes the aggressor. Strength becomes virtue. Restraint becomes weakness. Doubt becomes danger. The complexities of history, regional rivalry, nuclear diplomacy, domestic Iranian politics, American military commitments, and decades of mutual hostility are compressed into a simple command: choose a side. This simplification is not unique to Trump. American presidents from both parties have relied on the language of emergency. Different administrations have expanded executive power, conducted military operations without formal declarations of war, and defended secrecy in the name of national security. Trump did not create the machinery, but he has inherited a system in which presidents possess extraordinary tools and face limited immediate consequences for using them. That is what makes the current crisis larger than one man. Even those who oppose Trump should resist the comforting belief that replacing him would solve the problem. A power that exists for one president will exist for the next. An exception created against one enemy will be available against another. A constitutional restraint abandoned during one emergency may not return when the emergency ends. The question, therefore, is not merely whether Donald Trump can be trusted with the power to wage war. The deeper question is whether any president should possess such power without sustained congressional approval, public evidence, and clearly defined limits. A democracy cannot depend entirely on the virtue of its rulers. It must be designed to survive their ambition. Spinoza's first warning. Fear comes before superstition. Spinoza begins his analysis of political and religious manipulation with an uncomfortable observation. Human beings are most vulnerable to superstition when they are uncertain. When life seems stable, people often believe themselves to be rational. They imagine that their decisions arise from evidence, reflection, and deliberate judgment. But when the future becomes unpredictable, the mind changes. A person who does not know what tomorrow will bring becomes desperate for signs. He searches for patterns in coincidence. He listens to prophets. He attaches meaning to rumors. He becomes vulnerable to anyone who promises certainty. Spinoza writes that superstition is generated and sustained by fear. This insight reaches far beyond traditional religion. Superstition, in the Spinozist sense, is not limited to charms, omens, or supernatural beliefs. It is the broader human tendency to create emotionally comforting explanations when we do not understand the true causes of events. A frightened population does not simply ask, "What is happening?" It demands to know, who caused this? Who must be blamed? Who can save us? What sacrifice must be made? What must we obey so that safety will return? These questions are not irrational in themselves. When danger is real, citizens need information, leadership, and protection. But fear places pressure on the mind to accept answers before those answers have been adequately tested. This is how uncertainty becomes political opportunity. The leader who offers a complex explanation may appear weak. The leader who acknowledges limits may appear unprepared. The leader who says, "We do not yet know," may lose authority to the leader who declares, "I alone understand the danger." Fear rewards certainty, even false certainty, especially false certainty, because certainty provides something facts cannot always provide: emotional relief. A simple enemy is easier to fear than a complicated system. A decisive leader is easier to follow than an imperfect institution. A dramatic military response is easier to understand than years of diplomacy. A slogan is easier to remember than a history. This is why fear and political mythology grow together. The mythology may tell the public that America is uniquely virtuous, that its enemies are uniquely evil, and that military strength is the final guarantee of peace. Or it may offer the opposite mythology, that America is always the aggressor, that every adversary is merely a victim, and that all security threats are manufactured. Both stories can become forms of superstition when they replace investigation. Spinoza does not ask us to adopt a different slogan. He asks us to understand causes. Why did this conflict begin? Which decisions made escalation more likely? What incentives influence Iranian leaders? What incentives influence American leaders? What domestic political interests benefit from confrontation? Which military objectives are achievable? Which threats are immediate, and which are speculative? Which claims are supported by evidence? Which claims depend on emotional repetition? Reason begins when the mind refuses to confuse a powerful image with a complete explanation. But modern political communication is built around images: a missile rising into the night, a burning building, a grieving family, a president standing before the flag, a military commander pointing to a map, a religious leader declaring that the nation has been chosen for a historic purpose. None of these images is necessarily false, but each can become manipulative when it is separated from context. An image produces an emotion instantly. Understanding requires time. And in the competition between instant emotion and patient understanding, emotion usually arrives first. This gives political power an enormous advantage. The government does not need to persuade citizens through a complete argument. It only needs to shape the emotional environment in which arguments will later be heard. If the public has already been made sufficiently afraid, proposals that once appeared extreme can begin to sound reasonable. Expanded surveillance becomes protection. Censorship becomes responsibility. Military escalation becomes deterrence. Civilian suffering becomes unavoidable collateral damage. Congressional hesitation becomes dangerous obstruction. A frightened population may still debate, but the boundaries of debate have already been narrowed. The public may be permitted to ask how the war should be conducted. It may not be encouraged to ask whether the assumptions sustaining the war are true. This is one of the most effective forms of political control. It does not silence every voice. It determines which questions appear legitimate. Spinoza's philosophy, therefore, places freedom of thought at the center of political liberty. A citizen who is formally free to speak, but emotionally terrified of questioning the official narrative, does not possess complete freedom. A journalist who can legally criticize the government, but fears being branded disloyal, faces an invisible form of censorship. A legislator who privately doubts the war but worries that opposition will be used against him in the next election is not acting entirely from reason. Fear does not need to destroy democratic institutions. It can inhabit them. It can speak through them. It can use elections, speeches, hearings, and television debates while quietly limiting what can be imagined. This is why Spinoza's warning is so dangerous. He forces us to consider that a society can maintain the appearance of freedom while its citizens increasingly think inside boundaries created by fear. How political power turns anxiety into obedience. Political fear rarely announces itself as manipulation. It presents itself as responsibility. A government does not say, "We want you to be afraid so that you will grant us more power." It says, "We want you to understand the seriousness of the threat." It does not say, "We are reducing your ability to question us." It says, "There are facts that cannot be publicly revealed." It does not say, "We are transforming dissent into disloyalty." It says, "This is a moment when the country must stand together." The language is almost always protective. That is what makes it effective. The politics of fear typically moves through 4 stages. First, a threat must be made emotionally present. The danger may be real, exaggerated, or a mixture of both. What matters politically is that the citizen experiences it as immediate. Iran must not remain a distant country with a complicated government, competing internal factions, and a long history of conflict with the United States. It must become a presence inside the American imagination. A missile aimed at a city, a nuclear device hidden in the future, a terrorist network crossing the border, a hostile power waiting for American weakness. The citizen does not need to see the threat directly. He only needs to imagine it vividly enough. Second, the sense of time must be compressed. Political deliberation depends on time. Evidence must be gathered. Arguments must be compared. Legal authority must be examined. Consequences must be considered. But fear declares that time itself is dangerous. We must act now. We cannot wait. The enemy is moving. The window is closing. Hesitation will cost lives. Sometimes these claims are true. Military threats can require rapid responses. But urgency becomes abusive when it is repeatedly used to prevent scrutiny after the immediate danger has passed. An emergency decision made in hours cannot justify months of warfare without renewed examination. The third stage is moral division. The public is separated into those who understand the threat and those who supposedly do not. Supporters of escalation are described as serious, strong, and realistic. Critics are described as naive, weak, ideological, or sympathetic to the enemy. This division performs an important psychological function. It changes the cost of disagreement. A citizen no longer evaluates policy alone. He must also evaluate what opposing the policy will say about him. Will he be considered unpatriotic? Will his community reject him? Will he be accused of dishonoring soldiers? Will he appear indifferent to American lives? Once political disagreement threatens social identity, many people become silent. not because they have been logically persuaded, because the emotional price of speaking has become too high. The fourth stage is normalization. The exceptional measure becomes ordinary. A military operation that required emergency authority continues long after the original emergency. A temporary restriction becomes part of permanent procedure. A power once considered extraordinary becomes another instrument available to the executive branch. The public adapts. What shocked the nation in the first week becomes background noise by the fifth month. New casualty reports briefly appear on television and disappear. The financial cost becomes a number too large to imagine. The constitutional dispute becomes a technical argument for lawyers. The war continues, but the capacity to feel its continuation begins to fade. This may be the most dangerous stage of all. Not panic, habit. A population cannot remain at the highest level of fear forever. Eventually, fear becomes fatigue. Fatigue becomes resignation, and resignation becomes a quiet form of obedience. People begin to say, "There is nothing we can do. The government knows more than we do. The situation is too complicated. Both parties are the same. The war will continue no matter what the public wants." These statements may appear cynical, but cynicism can serve power just as effectively as loyalty. The obedient citizen is not always the person who passionately supports the government. Sometimes it is the person who has stopped believing resistance matters. Spinoza understood that political power depends not only on what people love or fear, but on what they believe themselves capable of changing. A population that feels powerless becomes easier to govern, not because it agrees, because it withdraws. This is why the struggle over the Iran war is also a struggle over democratic agency. The House vote matters even if the president resists it. The Senate vote matters even though the resolution failed. Public opinion matters even when military policy does not immediately change. These moments reveal that the legitimacy of the war is no longer secure, but they also reveal the limitations of public opposition. What does it mean when approximately 2/3 of Americans believe a war is not worth fighting, yet the conflict continues? What does representation mean when congressional restraint can be blocked by a single vote? What does consent mean when citizens are asked to support decisions based on intelligence they cannot independently examine? America often imagines freedom as the absence of direct tyranny, but Spinoza offers a more demanding standard. Freedom requires the capacity to understand the forces acting upon us. A person driven by fear may believe he is choosing freely while merely reacting to causes he does not comprehend. A nation can experience the same illusion. It can hold elections, broadcast debates, and celebrate its constitution while remaining emotionally governed by threats it has not learned to examine. The politics of fear does not eliminate choice. It arranges the emotional conditions under which choices are made. It does not command citizens to stop thinking. It makes thinking feel dangerous. And once thought itself becomes dangerous, obedience begins to feel like common sense. That is what America must see before it is too late. The central question is no longer simply whether Iran represents a threat. The question is whether fear of that threat has begun to alter the meaning of American freedom. Because a nation may defeat an enemy abroad and still lose something essential at home. It may preserve its military dominance while weakening constitutional restraint. It may defend its territory while surrendering public reason. It may call itself secure while becoming more dependent on fear with every passing day. And once fear becomes the foundation of political order, the war no longer needs to be won. It only needs to continue. Who has the right to send a nation to war? The question of war is always presented as a question of enemies. Who attacked? Who threatened? Who possesses the weapons? Who must be stopped? But beneath every war lies another question, one that is often less dramatic, yet far more important for the survival of a free society. Who possesses the authority to begin it? In the American constitutional system, the answer was never supposed to be simple. The president commands the armed forces. He must be capable of responding when American territory, troops, or citizens face an immediate attack. But Congress possesses the authority to declare war, approve military commitments, and control the money that sustains them. This division was not an accident. It was created because the power to send a nation into war is too dangerous to be concentrated in the hands of a single person. The framers of the American system understood ambition. They understood that leaders can mistake personal reputation for national interest. They understood that fear can make legislative bodies passive. They understood that military victories can increase political popularity. They also understood that the consequences of war are paid by people who do not sit inside the rooms where war is planned. A president may order an attack in minutes. A soldier may carry its consequences for the rest of his life. A family may receive a folded flag. A child may grow up without a parent. A taxpayer may finance the conflict for decades. A foreign civilian may lose a home, a limb, or an entire family without ever knowing the name of the official who authorized the strike. For this reason, the decision to wage sustained war was supposed to require something greater than executive certainty. It was supposed to require public argument, evidence, authorization, accountability, and yet the history of modern American war has gradually shifted power toward the presidency. Administrations of both parties have used broad interpretations of self-defense, inherited military authorizations and emergency powers to conduct operations without a traditional declaration of war. Each president inherits precedents created by the last. Each emergency stretches the limits a little further. Each use of force becomes evidence that similar force may be used again. Eventually, the exceptional becomes routine. This is how constitutions are weakened without being formally destroyed. The text remains. The ceremonies remain. The branches of government continue to meet. But the actual balance of power changes through habit. The war with Iran has brought this constitutional tension into public view. On July 23, the House of Representatives voted 214 to 208 in favor of directing President Trump to end unauthorized military action against Iran. A subsequent Senate effort to restrain the president's war authority failed by the narrowest possible margin, 49 to 50. These votes revealed both substantial congressional resistance and the severe institutional difficulty of restraining a president once military operations are already underway. The political significance of these votes extends beyond whether any single resolution becomes binding. They expose a structural problem. Congress is often most powerful before a war begins, yet it is often most reluctant to act at precisely that moment. Before military action, legislators fear being blamed for preventing the president from responding to danger. After military action begins, they fear being blamed for undermining troops in the field. Before casualties occur, restraint is portrayed as weakness. After casualties occur, withdrawal is portrayed as dishonoring sacrifice. The longer the conflict continues, the greater the political cost of stopping it. War therefore creates momentum not only on the battlefield, but inside institutions. Every death becomes an argument that previous deaths must not have been in vain. Every dollar spent becomes an argument for spending more. Every attack creates the demand for retaliation. Every retaliation generates the possibility of another attack. This cycle is often called escalation, but Spinoza would see something deeper. He would see a chain of causes in which human beings feel free while being driven by emotions they do not fully understand. The president says he must respond because failure to respond would invite more aggression. Congress says it must support the president because division would embolden the enemy. Citizens say they must stand behind the country because criticism during war feels disloyal. Media organizations say they must emphasize dramatic threats because the public needs to understand the danger. Each actor believes he is making a necessary choice, yet the combined result may be a machine that no single actor knows how to stop. This is why Spinoza's understanding of freedom is more demanding than the ordinary political definition. For Spinoza, freedom is not simply doing what one desires. A person may act on his strongest desire and still be unfree if that desire is controlled by fear, anger, or causes he does not comprehend. A nation may also act according to its apparent will while being driven by emotional forces it has failed to examine. The United States may possess overwhelming military power and still lack political freedom if its institutions cannot resist the momentum of fear. This creates a dangerous paradox. The president claims freedom of action is necessary to defend the nation. Congress hesitates to restrict him because it fears the consequences of appearing divided. The public is told that constitutional debate must not interfere with military urgency. But if constitutional limits disappear whenever leaders invoke national danger, then the danger has already changed the Constitution. A free society does not prove its commitment to law during peaceful moments. Law is easiest to respect when nothing important appears to be at stake. The true test comes when fear makes restraint seem inconvenient. Anyone can defend civil liberties when no one feels threatened. Anyone can praise checks and balances when the branches agree. Anyone can respect congressional authority when the president has no urgent military objective. The value of constitutional restraint is revealed precisely when leaders believe they have compelling reasons to ignore it. The question is therefore not whether President Trump believes his decisions are necessary. He almost certainly does. The question is not whether his supporters sincerely believe Iran poses a threat. Many of them do. The question is whether sincerity is enough. History is filled with sincere leaders who accumulated power during emergencies. It is filled with patriotic citizens who surrendered oversight because they believed the danger was temporary. It is filled with wars that began as limited measures and became realities no one had originally chosen. Spinoza's political thought offers no comforting belief that good intentions can neutralize concentrated power. A wise political system does not assume that rulers will always be virtuous. It organizes power so that rulers must face resistance, criticism, and institutional limits. The president may possess information the public does not, but secrecy cannot become a permanent substitute for consent. Military commanders may understand operational risks better than legislators, but military expertise cannot decide the political purpose of war. Intelligence agencies may identify threats, but intelligence cannot determine how much freedom a society should surrender in response. These are political judgments, and in a democracy, political judgment cannot belong exclusively to those who command weapons. The authority to wage war ultimately raises a question about the meaning of citizenship. Are citizens merely people whom the government protects? Or are they participants in determining what protection requires? Are they expected only to pay, obey, and mourn? Or do they possess the right to demand evidence before violence is carried out in their name? A nation cannot call its people sovereign while excluding them from its gravest decisions. The battlefield may be thousands of miles away, but the struggle over who possesses the authority to continue the war is taking place at the center of American democracy, and the outcome may survive long after the final missile is fired. Because whatever power is accepted today will become a precedent tomorrow. Whatever one president is permitted to do against Iran, another may later do against a different nation. Whatever Congress fails to defend now may be harder to recover in the next crisis. A constitution does not collapse all at once. Sometimes it recedes one emergency at a time. The creation of the absolute enemy. War requires an enemy, but prolonged war often requires something more. It requires an absolute enemy. An ordinary enemy has interests. He possesses fears, internal divisions, historical grievances, and political objectives. An absolute enemy has only evil. He does not negotiate because he cannot be trusted. He does not respond to incentives because he understands only force. He does not possess citizens, factions, or competing institutions. He becomes a single hostile will. This transformation is politically powerful because complexity makes violence difficult. When citizens see the enemy as human, questions arise. Who will be harmed? Which factions oppose the government? Could pressure strengthen hardliners? Could diplomacy divide the enemy's leadership? Could military action produce consequences more dangerous than the original threat? But when the enemy becomes absolute, these questions begin to sound immoral. Why negotiate with evil? Why understand hatred? Why distinguish civilians from leaders who claim to represent them? Why search for causes when condemnation feels sufficient? The phrase Iran is often used as though it describes one unified mind. Iran wants war. Iran hates America. Iran supports terrorism. Iran seeks nuclear weapons. Iran understands only strength. Yet Iran is not a person. It is a country of tens of millions of human beings. It contains clerics, military commanders, reformists, nationalists, students, workers, religious conservatives, secular dissidents, ethnic minorities, business owners, families, and political prisoners. Some support the regime. Some fear it. Some oppose American power. Some oppose their own government. Some desire reform. Some seek confrontation. Some simply want to survive. None of this means the Iranian state is harmless. Its government has used repression. Its security structures have controlled information and punished opposition. Its military relationships and regional activities have created real danger. A serious analysis must acknowledge these facts. But Spinoza would insist that moral condemnation is not the same as causal understanding. To understand a danger is not to excuse it. It is to become more capable of responding effectively. Anger says, "They are evil." Reason asks, "What causes them to act this way?" Fear says, "Destroy the threat." Reason asks, "What happens after destruction?" Propaganda says, "They are all the same." Understanding searches for distinctions. These distinctions matter because military force does not strike abstractions. It strikes bodies, buildings, roads, electrical systems, ports, communications networks, and places where people live. A government may claim that its targets are precise, but the social effects of war are never precise. When infrastructure is destroyed, civilians lose electricity. When shipping is disrupted, food and medicine become more expensive. When fear spreads, families flee. When sanctions deepen, the politically connected often survive, while ordinary people bear the burden. When foreign attacks intensify, domestic hardliners may gain the very legitimacy they previously lacked. An authoritarian regime can use external war to silence internal critics. It can call dissent collaboration. It can impose emergency controls. It can present itself as the defender of national survival. This reveals one of war's darkest symmetries. American leaders may use fear of Iran to consolidate political support. Iranian leaders may use fear of America to consolidate their own. Each government points to the other as proof that greater obedience is necessary. Each attack validates the enemy's propaganda. Each side tells its citizens, "You see? We warned you." This is why the politics of absolute enemies can become self-sustaining. The more each side behaves as the other predicts, the more each public believes the worst possible interpretation. Americans see Iranian retaliation and conclude diplomacy was impossible. Iranians see American strikes and conclude the United States always intended domination. The possibility that both governments are responding to pressures, incentives, and internal struggles disappears. Only the image of evil remains. Spinoza's philosophy challenges this moral simplification because he rejects the idea that events occur outside causality. Human beings do not become less responsible when we understand their causes, but responsibility without understanding cannot guide intelligent action. To say that a leader acts from fear, ambition, ideology, or institutional pressure does not absolve him. It identifies the forces that must be addressed if his behavior is to change. Imagine a doctor who condemned a disease but refused to study its mechanism. His moral hatred of the disease would not cure the patient. In politics, however, condemnation is often mistaken for strength. The leader who speaks most aggressively appears most serious. The analyst who introduces complexity is accused of making excuses. The citizen who distinguishes between the Iranian people and the Iranian state may be told he is minimizing the threat. But refusing to understand an enemy does not make a nation safer. It makes the nation predictable. An enemy who knows that every provocation will trigger retaliation can manipulate the stronger power. A regional actor can provoke an attack precisely because it wants the conflict widened. A hardline faction can sabotage diplomacy because war strengthens its domestic position. A government that reacts automatically to every humiliation may possess tremendous force but very little freedom. This is another Spinozist paradox. The more a nation is ruled by anger, the easier it becomes for its enemy to govern its behavior. If Iran can determine American decisions merely by provoking American rage, then Iran has acquired a form of power over the United States. True strength would require the ability to experience anger without becoming its instrument. It would require distinguishing what feels satisfying from what produces security. A retaliatory strike may satisfy the demand to act. It may communicate resolve. It may destroy a military asset. But does it reduce the long-term danger? Does it weaken the faction responsible? Does it make further attacks less likely? Does it bring the political objective closer? Or does it simply preserve the emotional image of strength? These questions do not produce easy answers. That is precisely why they matter. The absolute enemy frees leaders from the burden of answering them. If the enemy is pure evil, then any violence directed against him becomes self-justifying. Failure proves more force is necessary. Resistance proves the enemy is irrational. Retaliation proves the original attack was justified. Negotiation becomes appeasement. Peace becomes suspicious. The enemy can never do anything that challenges the narrative, because every action is interpreted through the same moral frame. Spinoza would call this a failure of adequate knowledge. The public no longer encounters events as events. It encounters them through an image already constructed by fear. The purpose of philosophical thought is not to make citizens passive in the presence of danger. It is to free them from reactions that others can predict and exploit. America does not need to love Iran. It does not need to trust the Iranian government. It does not need to deny military threats. It needs something more difficult. It needs to understand the enemy without becoming psychologically dependent on hating him. Because once a nation needs an enemy to preserve its own political unity, Ending the war can become more threatening than continuing it. God, evil, and the sacred language of war. Political power rarely relies on force alone. It seeks moral meaning. A war that appears merely strategic may lose public support when costs rise. A war presented as sacred can demand sacrifices that ordinary politics could never obtain. This is why religious language has so often entered the vocabulary of nations at war. Leaders speak of providence. They describe the nation as chosen. They portray sacrifice as holy. They divide the world between light and darkness. They ask God to bless military action. They suggest that history itself has assigned their nation a special mission. In the United States, this language carries extraordinary emotional force. American political identity has long contained a belief that the country represents more than a state. It is imagined as an idea, a promise, a city upon a hill, a defender of liberty, a nation with a moral responsibility to resist tyranny. At its best, this belief has inspired real courage. It has motivated citizens to oppose oppression and defend human dignity. But every sacred identity contains a danger. If a nation believes it represents goodness itself, it may become unable to recognize injustice committed in its own name. Its violence appears defensive by definition. Its expansion appears benevolent. Its failures are treated as mistakes, while the enemy's failures are treated as proof of essential evil. This moral asymmetry is one of the foundations of permanent war. Spinoza wrote during an age when religious authorities possessed enormous political power. Theological disputes could produce censorship, persecution, exile, and bloodshed. Competing groups claimed divine authority. Each believed sacred truth belonged to it alone. Each could describe political opponents as enemies not merely of the state, but of God. Spinoza understood that this combination was explosive. When political disagreement becomes theological conflict, compromise becomes almost impossible. A political opponent may be mistaken. A religious enemy appears damned. A policy can be revised. A sacred command cannot. This is why Spinoza sought to separate the purpose of religion from the purpose of philosophy. Religion, as he understood its socially valuable form, should encourage justice, compassion, and ethical conduct. Philosophy should seek truth through reason. When religious authorities claim control over knowledge, they transform faith into intellectual domination. When political rulers claim divine approval, they transform government into something beyond criticism. Spinoza's defense of freedom of thought was therefore inseparable from his concern about peace. He argued that a stable state should permit people to think and speak freely, rather than attempting to control their minds through religious authority. This insight applies directly to the politics of war. Consider what happens when a military conflict is framed as a battle between God's order and demonic chaos. Negotiation no longer appears practical. It appears sinful. Restraint no longer appears strategic. It appears cowardly. Criticism of the leader no longer appears democratic. It appears like an attack on the sacred mission of the nation. The president may not explicitly claim to speak for God. He does not need to. Religious leaders, political activists, and media figures can create the connection for him. They can interpret military events through prophecy. They can present victory as evidence of divine favor. They can portray opposition as spiritual blindness. The sacred language of war is especially powerful because it protects political claims from ordinary examination. A military objective can be measured. A divine mission cannot. A strategic prediction can fail. A prophecy can always be reinterpreted. A policy can be challenged with evidence. A sacred narrative turns evidence into a test of faith. This is not an argument against religion. It is an argument against converting faith into political immunity. Millions of religious Americans oppose war because of their faith. They emphasize the sanctity of life, the duty to seek peace, and the moral danger of vengeance. Religious conviction can restrain power as well as support it. The problem arises when one interpretation is identified with the nation itself. When supporters of war claim exclusive ownership of patriotism and faith, citizens are forced into a false choice: support military escalation or appear disloyal to both God and country. Spinoza would reject this choice. He would judge religion by the conduct it produces. Does it encourage justice? Does it reduce hatred? Does it cultivate mercy? Does it allow people of different beliefs to live together peacefully? Or does it strengthen fear, obedience, and persecution? A religious message that praises domination while ignoring suffering has lost its ethical purpose. A sermon that turns political loyalty into a test of faith has confused God with government. A nation that invokes divine blessing while refusing public accountability is not demonstrating confidence. It is protecting itself from judgment. The danger becomes even greater when the enemy is represented as religiously alien. Iran is not simply described as a strategic competitor. It is described as an Islamic theocracy. Its religious structures, political repression, and hostility toward Israel become part of a civilizational narrative. The conflict can then be interpreted not as a dispute between governments, but as a confrontation between religions or civilizations. This framing benefits extremists on both sides. American religious nationalists can portray the war as a defense of Christian civilization. Iranian hardliners can portray it as proof that the West seeks the destruction of Islam. Each side feeds the other's sacred narrative. Moderates become suspicious. Diplomats become traitors. Civilian suffering becomes evidence that coexistence was always impossible. What begins as geopolitical conflict takes on metaphysical significance, and metaphysical wars have no natural endpoint. Territory can be negotiated. Weapons can be limited. Sanctions can be lifted. Security guarantees can be designed. But how does one negotiate with absolute evil? How can a peace agreement end a battle believed to be written into divine history? This is why sacred language can make war endless. It changes the purpose of victory. The goal is no longer to obtain a defined political outcome. The goal becomes purification, the defeat of evil, the vindication of the chosen nation. No military success can permanently achieve these aims because evil, as a metaphysical category, can always return. The public remains mobilized. Fear remains useful. Power remains protected. Spinoza's alternative is not a society without faith. It is a society in which faith cannot silence reason. A believer may pray for the nation. A pastor may offer moral guidance. A citizen may interpret events through religious conviction. But no government should be permitted to transform its policies into divine commands. No president should stand beyond criticism because religious supporters have placed him inside a sacred story. No war should escape constitutional judgment because it has been described as a battle between good and evil. The moment political power claims sacred authority, disagreement is transformed into heresy. And when dissent becomes heresy, democracy has already begun to disappear. Why people fight for their own servitude. One of the most disturbing questions in political philosophy is not why rulers seek power. That is easy to understand. Power gives leaders influence, security, status, and the ability to shape events. The more difficult question is why ordinary people sometimes defend systems that reduce their own freedom. Why do citizens support wars that burden their families? Why do they excuse powers they would condemn in an opposing president? Why do they defend censorship when their own voices may eventually be silenced? Why do they celebrate the expansion of government authority when that authority may later be turned against them? Why do people fight as though their liberation were a threat? This question stands near the heart of Spinoza's political project. Human beings do not simply obey because soldiers force them. They obey because political power becomes connected to their desires, fears, identities, and hopes. The state does not rule only from above. It enters the emotional life of the citizen. The first reason people defend servitude is that obedience can feel safe. Freedom is often described as though it were effortless, but genuine freedom places a burden on the individual. A free citizen must judge competing claims. He must live with uncertainty. He must accept that no leader possesses complete knowledge. He must recognize that his own political group can be wrong. He must remain responsible for choices whose consequences cannot be known in advance. Authoritarian certainty removes this burden. The strong leader says, "Trust me, I understand the enemy. I alone can protect you. Do not listen to the doubters. Do not worry about the process. Do not ask for information that would compromise the mission." For a frightened person, these words may feel like relief. He no longer has to carry uncertainty. He transfers it to the leader. The cost is dependence. The second reason is identity. Political beliefs are rarely isolated intellectual conclusions. They become part of the person. A citizen does not merely support Trump. He may see Trump as a symbol of his dignity, his community, and his resistance to institutions he believes have ignored or despised him. Another citizen does not merely oppose Trump. She may see opposition as inseparable from her moral identity and understanding of democracy. When a leader becomes part of identity, criticism of that leader feels personal. Evidence no longer arrives as neutral information. It arrives as an attack. If Trump's Iran policy is failing, then the supporter may feel he is being called foolish for believing in Trump. If the war is unjustified, he may feel accused of supporting injustice. If the president has expanded power dangerously, the supporter may hear the claim that his entire political movement is illegitimate. Defensiveness appears before reflection. This is not unique to Trump's supporters. Partisan identity operates across political groups. People excuse in their own side what they condemn in the other. They adjust moral standards to protect belonging. The principle becomes secondary. The tribe becomes primary. The third reason people defend servitude is sacrifice. Once individuals have paid a price for a belief, abandoning it becomes psychologically difficult. A family that has lost a son in war needs his death to possess meaning. A veteran who endured trauma needs to believe the mission was worthy. A citizen who defended the conflict for months may resist evidence that it was misguided. The greater the sacrifice, the stronger the emotional need to justify it. This produces a tragic logic. The suffering caused by war becomes an argument for continuing the war. We cannot withdraw because people have died. But if more people die, the same argument becomes even stronger. Eventually, no amount of suffering can justify stopping because every new loss has been absorbed into the demand that previous losses be redeemed. The fourth reason is social belonging. Human beings are not purely independent thinkers. They are profoundly affected by the people around them. A church community, family, online group, or workplace may possess a shared political language. Certain opinions produce approval. Others produce discomfort. The individual learns what can be said without punishment. He may still believe he is free because no law prevents him from speaking. But the fear of rejection can be stronger than the fear of legal penalties. A person may remain silent to preserve friendships. He may repeat claims he privately doubts. He may gradually adopt the group's beliefs because constant disagreement is exhausting. This is how conformity becomes sincere. People do not always lie to others. Sometimes they change themselves so that lying is no longer necessary. The fifth reason is the fear of the alternative. Citizens may dislike a leader's actions yet believe every alternative would be worse. They may fear that restraining the president will embolden Iran. They may fear that ending the war will produce a larger attack. They may fear that political opponents will take power. They may fear social disorder more than executive overreach. This is how people come to tolerate what they recognize as harmful, not because they believe it is good, because they have been taught to imagine something worse. Spinoza understood that people endure present suffering when they fear a greater loss. Political power, therefore, does not need to make citizens happy. It only needs to convince them that disobedience would bring catastrophe. The citizen says, "I do not like the war, but withdrawal would be worse. I do not trust the government, but the enemy is more dangerous. I do not support censorship, but misinformation must be controlled. I do not want executive power expanded, but this is an emergency." Each compromise appears temporary. Together, they create a condition of permanent dependence. Yet Spinoza would not describe these citizens as simply stupid. That explanation is emotionally satisfying but philosophically weak. People act according to the ideas, experiences, and emotions available to them. A citizen who lives inside a constant stream of threat will make different judgments from one who feels secure. A person whose community rewards aggression will interpret restraint differently from one whose community values diplomacy. To understand obedience, we must understand the environment that produces it. This does not eliminate responsibility. It allows responsibility to become useful. Condemning millions of citizens as irrational will not free them from fear. It may deepen their attachment to the leader who tells them they are under attack. The politics of humiliation strengthens the politics of resentment. A democratic alternative must offer more than moral superiority. It must offer security without submission, belonging without conformity, patriotism without obedience to one man, strength without permanent war. This is difficult because fear is immediate. Reason is slow. A threat can unite people overnight. A democratic culture may require generations to build. A leader can create loyalty by naming an enemy. A free society must create solidarity among people who disagree. The temptation of servitude is therefore always present. It promises simplicity. The leader will decide. The military will protect. The faithful will obey. The doubters will be excluded. The enemy will explain our problems. The future will become clear, but the clarity is false. A nation cannot escape uncertainty by surrendering freedom. It can only surrender its ability to respond intelligently. Spinoza's warning is not that people love chains. They rarely recognize them as chains. They experience them as protection. They call obedience loyalty. They call silence unity. They call fear vigilance. They call the inability to stop a war strength. This is how servitude survives in a society that worships freedom. It changes its name. Trump is not the entire system. It is easy to believe that the crisis begins and ends with Donald Trump. His personality dominates American politics. His speeches produce loyalty, anger, fear, and fascination. He has transformed the presidency into a continuous performance of conflict. He presents himself as the man willing to do what weaker leaders refuse to do. For supporters, he represents resistance to bureaucratic paralysis and elite hypocrisy. For opponents, he represents the dangerous concentration of power, the erosion of democratic norms, and the politics of personal rule. Both groups may therefore make the same mistake. They may imagine that Trump is the system. He is not. He is an unusually powerful expression of tendencies that existed before him. The expansion of presidential war authority did not begin with Trump. Neither did secrecy, surveillance, military intervention, emergency government, or the political use of fear. Presidents from both major parties have conducted military operations without formal declarations of war. They have relied on broad authorizations, classified intelligence, and flexible interpretations of executive power. They have described threats as urgent. They have argued that congressional delay would endanger national security. They have promised limited missions that expanded over time. Trump inherited these precedents. He did not need to build the machinery from nothing. The machinery was waiting. This matters because the political system encourages citizens to focus on personality. Personalities are easier to understand than institutions. A villain can be defeated. A hero can be elected. A corrupt ruler can be replaced. But a structure distributed across agencies, laws, precedents, contractors, military commands, intelligence institutions, and political incentives is harder to confront. Removing one president does not remove the authorities his predecessors created. Electing a more polite leader does not restore constitutional balance. A president can speak calmly while exercising the same power. He can use sophisticated language rather than insults. He can consult experts. He can show greater empathy. None of this guarantees institutional restraint. The problem is therefore not simply that Trump may misuse presidential authority. The problem is that so much authority exists to be used. This distinction is essential. Partisans tend to judge power according to who holds it. When their preferred president acts, the action appears necessary. When the opposing president does the same, it appears tyrannical. The same surveillance tool becomes either national protection or government abuse. The same military strike becomes either decisive leadership or reckless aggression. The same executive order becomes either necessary action or constitutional overreach. Principle dissolves into loyalty. Spinoza would recognize this as government by imagination. Citizens respond not to the structure of power, but to the image of the person exercising it. They love the leader and therefore interpret the power as good. They hate the leader and therefore interpret the power as evil. But institutions cannot be safely designed around personal affection. A power that is acceptable only when a virtuous person holds it is not a safe power. No political system can guarantee virtue. Even well-intentioned leaders make mistakes. They receive incomplete intelligence. They respond to political pressure. They fear humiliation. They become attached to policies. They surround themselves with advisors who share their assumptions. They may sincerely believe that opposition endangers the nation. This is why constitutional restraint must operate regardless of personality. It must restrain the president we admire as well as the president we fear. Trump's critics should therefore ask themselves a difficult question. Would they oppose the same war powers if a president from their own party used them? Would they demand congressional approval with the same urgency? Would they question classified intelligence? Would they defend dissenters accused of weakening the country? Would they accept the same standard of accountability? If the answer changes with the party, then the defense of constitutional government is not yet complete. Trump's supporters must confront a parallel question. Would they trust these powers in the hands of a leader they considered hostile to their values? Would they permit that president to conduct an extended war without clear authorization? Would they accept secret evidence? Would they tolerate the accusation that criticism was disloyal? Would they believe executive flexibility was more important than congressional consent? A durable political principle must survive the transfer of power. This is why the current conflict should concern even those who trust Trump completely. The precedents he strengthens will not belong to him forever. Future presidents will inherit them. They may use them for different wars, different enemies, and different political objectives. Every expansion of power carries a hidden promise. Someone you oppose may eventually possess it. Trump is therefore both central and secondary. He is central because he is making real decisions with immediate consequences. He is secondary because the deeper question concerns a system that repeatedly concentrates power during crisis. The machinery of permanent war includes far more than the White House. It includes defense contractors whose profits depend on military expenditure. It includes legislators whose districts benefit from weapons production. It includes intelligence agencies whose warnings shape policy but often remain classified. It includes media organizations rewarded for dramatic conflict. It includes political consultants who convert foreign threats into campaign messages. It includes think tanks, lobbying groups, donors, and regional allies with their own strategic interests. This does not mean every participant conspires to create war. Systems do not require secret coordination. They can emerge from aligned incentives. The contractor seeks profit. The legislator seeks re-election. The military planner prepares for danger. The intelligence analyst identifies threats. The media network seeks attention. The president seeks strength. Each actor follows an understandable motive. Together, they create pressure toward escalation. This is why moral outrage directed at one man can be politically insufficient. Trump may leave office. The incentives will remain. Another crisis will emerge. Another president will be told that failure to act immediately could produce catastrophe. Another Congress will hesitate. Another public will be frightened. The names will change. The logic will not. Spinoza teaches us to search beneath personalities for causes. Do not merely ask whether Trump is dangerous. Ask what conditions make his style of power effective. Do not merely ask whether he lies. Ask why millions find the certainty of his claims more persuasive than institutional complexity. Do not merely ask whether he should be replaced. Ask what powers his replacement will inherit. The goal is not to absolve leaders by blaming the system. It is to recognize that accountability must operate at both levels. Individuals make choices. Institutions shape which choices are rewarded. A president who escalates war must be judged. A Congress that abandons its authority must also be judged. A media system that converts fear into profit must be examined. A public that excuses abuses committed by its own political side must confront itself. This is a harder story than the story of one dangerous man, but it is also more honest. Trump may be the face of this moment. He is not the beginning of the machinery. And unless the machinery itself is restrained, he will not be its end. The media economy of fear. Previous generations experienced war through delayed reports. News traveled through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and carefully edited film. Today, conflict enters the human nervous system in real time. A missile launch appears on a phone seconds after it occurs. An explosion is replayed from multiple angles. A political statement spreads across platforms before journalists can verify it. Rumors travel faster than correction. Images of violence compete with advertisements, entertainment, and personal messages on the same screen. The citizen carries the battlefield in his pocket. This technological transformation has created the illusion of complete access. We see more. We receive more updates. We hear more voices. But more information does not automatically create greater understanding. It may create the opposite. The human mind has limited attention. When information arrives faster than it can be examined, people rely on emotional shortcuts. They judge credibility through identity. They accept claims repeated by trusted communities. They react to headlines without reading evidence. They confuse visibility with importance. The event that produces the strongest image becomes the event that appears most significant. This is ideal territory for the politics of fear. Fear is fast. It does not require context. A video of an explosion communicates danger instantly. A map filled with red arrows creates the impression of invasion. A presenter speaking urgently can make a possibility feel inevitable. A dramatic phrase, nuclear threat, imminent attack, regional collapse, can dominate public imagination long before its probability is established. Reason is slower. It asks where the image came from. When was it recorded? What occurred before the clip began? Who benefits from its circulation? Does the image represent a broad pattern or a single event? What evidence supports the interpretation attached to it? By the time these questions are answered, public emotion may already have moved on. The economic structure of modern media intensifies the problem. Attention produces revenue. Fear attracts attention. Anger keeps viewers watching. Certainty is easier to market than nuance. A headline that says, Experts disagree about the long-term strategic consequences, will struggle against one that says, America under threat. A discussion of competing interpretations will appear weak beside a confident declaration that catastrophe is approaching. Media organizations do not need to receive instructions from the government. They possess their own incentives to dramatize danger. Political leaders understand this environment. They craft messages designed to dominate it. A forceful statement can replace a detailed policy. An insult can redirect the news cycle. A threat can demonstrate strength without requiring immediate action. A social media post can create facts on the ground by forcing allies, enemies, and institutions to respond. The distinction between governing and performing becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. This does not mean every dramatic warning is false. Iranian attacks, military casualties, and threats to energy routes are real news. Citizens deserve rapid information. But information becomes manipulation when uncertainty is concealed. A possibility may be presented as a prediction. An intelligence assessment may be presented as established truth. A disputed claim may be repeated until its disputed nature disappears. A temporary development may be framed as permanent transformation. The audience experiences constant emergency. In this environment, two opposing propaganda systems can flourish simultaneously. One tells Americans, Iran is irrational. War is unavoidable. Only overwhelming force can protect you. The other says, every American claim is a lie. Iran poses no meaningful danger. All military action is driven entirely by profit or imperial ambition. Each system offers emotional certainty. Each reduces complexity. Each transforms facts that challenge the narrative into evidence of conspiracy. The citizen is encouraged to choose between total loyalty and total distrust. Spinoza offers another path. He distinguishes inadequate ideas from more adequate understanding. An inadequate idea may contain part of the truth. The problem is not always that it is completely false. The problem is that it is disconnected from the broader chain of causes. A video of an Iranian missile is real, but it does not explain why the missile was launched. A statement by Trump is real, but it does not reveal whether the policy will achieve its stated objective. A report of civilian casualties is real, but it does not by itself explain the full military context. Understanding requires relationships, cause, sequence, comparison, proportion. These are precisely the elements that disappear when politics is compressed into viral content. The algorithm does not ask whether information makes citizens wiser. It asks whether they remain engaged. An anxious user refreshes the screen. An angry user comments. A frightened user shares warnings. A partisan user returns to defend his group. The emotional disturbance of the public becomes economically valuable. This creates a new form of power. Governments once attempted to control information by limiting access. Modern political systems can influence citizens by overwhelming them. The problem is no longer silence. It is noise. Thousands of claims compete. Contradictions multiply. Every source is accused of bias. Citizens become exhausted. Eventually, many stop trying to determine what is true. They retreat into trusted communities. Truth becomes tribal. This exhaustion serves power. A citizen who believes nothing can be verified becomes dependent on identity. He asks not, is this true? He asks, who is saying it? If the statement comes from his side, he accepts it. If it comes from the other side, he rejects it. Political leaders no longer need to establish credibility universally. They need only preserve loyalty within their audience. This is why modern propaganda does not always seek to persuade everyone. It seeks to prevent a shared reality from forming. Without shared facts, democratic judgment becomes nearly impossible. Congressional hearings become performances. Investigations become partisan rituals. Casualty figures become political weapons. Intelligence becomes something each side accepts only when useful. The public cannot meaningfully consent to war when it cannot agree on what is happening. Spinoza's defense of free thought is therefore not a defense of unlimited noise. It is a defense of the conditions under which people can seek understanding. Freedom of thought requires access to competing arguments. It also requires education, patience, and intellectual discipline. A person who merely consumes every available claim is not necessarily free. He may be more easily manipulated than someone who receives less information but examines it carefully. The solution is not withdrawal from all news. Ignorance does not produce reason. The solution is to change the relationship to information. Before sharing a claim, ask what supports it. Before reacting to an image, ask what it excludes. Before accepting certainty, Ask who benefits from making uncertainty invisible. Before repeating the language of threat, ask whether the language clarifies the danger or magnifies it. This is not passive skepticism. It is political self-defense. A population unable to control its attention cannot easily control its government. A citizen whose emotional state is continuously shaped by algorithms possesses less freedom than he imagines. He may choose what to click, but the environment has already chosen what he sees. The media economy of fear does not command obedience directly. It creates exhaustion, division, and emotional dependence. And in that condition, the leader who promises certainty becomes more powerful. A society may possess more information than any civilization in history and still understand less. It may see every explosion and fail to see the system. It may hear every speech and fail to recognize the pattern. It may know what happened 5 minutes ago and have no idea why the war continues. The price of fear is paid at home. Every government speaks of war in national terms. America acts. Iran responds. The military advances. The administration decides. But nations do not suffer. People do. The economic language of war can conceal this reality. Billions of dollars become appropriations. Destroyed equipment becomes replacement cost. Deaths become casualty figures. Disrupted trade becomes market volatility. Rising fuel prices become an inflationary effect. These phrases are administratively useful. They are also emotionally distant. The true cost of war appears in smaller places. A nurse drives farther to work and pays more for gasoline. A family cancels a trip because transportation costs have risen. A small business sees shipping expenses increase. A soldier's spouse watches the news late at night, waiting for a message. A veteran recognizes sounds and images that return him to an earlier war. A parent tries to explain to a child why another deployment is necessary. A taxpayer contributes to weapons while the local school loses programs. A city postpones infrastructure repairs. A hospital struggles with funding. A family in Iran loses electricity after an attack on infrastructure. A civilian on either side pays for decisions made by people with greater protection. This is how geopolitical strategy enters ordinary life. The latest AP NORC findings show that approximately 2/3 of American adults believe the Iran war has not been worth fighting, while concerns about gasoline prices and the domestic economic burden have become major public priorities. Support for negotiating a ceasefire also exceeds support for an open-ended continuation of hostilities. These attitudes reveal more than political dissatisfaction. They reveal a growing separation between the government's definition of security and the citizen's experience of insecurity. The government says the war protects the nation. The citizen asks why daily life feels less stable. The administration speaks of strategic credibility. The household calculates food, fuel, rent, and debt. The military speaks of deterrence. The family waits for someone to return. This does not mean economic discomfort should automatically determine foreign policy. A country may sometimes need to bear real costs to defend itself or others. Principle can require sacrifice. But sacrifice is morally defensible only when those demanding it explain its purpose honestly. What is the objective? How likely is it to succeed? What alternatives were considered? How long will the commitment last? Who will bear the burden? What evidence would demonstrate that the policy is failing? Without answers, sacrifice becomes a blank check. Spinoza understood the state as something created to increase the ability of people to live securely and exercise their capacities. The purpose of political society is not merely to prevent physical death. A prison can keep a person alive. An authoritarian regime can maintain order. A military occupation can suppress visible conflict. But security worthy of free people must involve more than survival. People must be able to think, work, form relationships, speak, worship, create, and pursue a life not dominated by fear. A government that protects citizens from one danger while making them permanently dependent on anxiety has achieved only a narrow form of security. This raises a question rarely asked during war. What exactly is being defended? If America is defending a territory, military power may be enough. If it is defending a way of life, then the means matter. A nation cannot protect constitutional freedom by normalizing unconstitutional power. It cannot defend democratic values by treating public consent as an obstacle. It cannot preserve prosperity through commitments that steadily weaken households. It cannot honor soldiers while using their sacrifice to prevent debate. The phrase, "support the troops," has often been used to end political disagreement. But genuine support requires asking whether the mission is clear, legal, and achievable. It requires caring for veterans after public attention moves elsewhere. It requires refusing to send people into danger merely because political leaders fear appearing weak. The highest respect for military service is not automatic approval of every military action. It is the insistence that such service never be wasted. War also creates opportunity costs. Every dollar directed toward conflict is a dollar unavailable for another purpose. This does not mean defense spending is inherently wasteful. A country needs military capability, but resources are finite. Money spent replacing weapons cannot simultaneously repair bridges. Funds used to sustain distant operations cannot simultaneously strengthen public health, education, or disaster preparation. Political leaders often present security as though military and domestic needs exist in separate universes. They do not. A nation with powerful weapons but deteriorating institutions is not fully secure. A society capable of striking targets abroad but unable to provide stability at home has misunderstood power. Spinoza's philosophy connects political strength to collective capacity. A powerful society is not simply one that can destroy. It is one whose people can act, think, and cooperate effectively. Fear weakens this capacity. It divides citizens. It narrows attention. It redirects resources toward permanent emergency. It makes long-term investment politically invisible because immediate threats dominate public imagination. The bridge can wait. The school can wait. The hospital can wait. The debt can wait. The climate can wait. The housing crisis can wait. The war cannot wait. This is how emergency consumes the future. Everything not connected to the immediate threat becomes secondary. But the neglected problems do not disappear. They deepen. Eventually, the nation discovers that its greatest vulnerabilities were allowed to grow, while attention remained fixed on an external enemy. A free society must therefore compare dangers rather than simply respond to whichever danger is presented most dramatically. How serious is the threat from Iran? How serious is the threat of economic instability? How serious is the expansion of executive power? How serious is the collapse of public trust? How serious is political violence at home? How serious is the inability of institutions to solve ordinary problems? Security requires proportion. Fear destroys proportion. It makes one danger occupy the entire horizon. The public becomes willing to sacrifice nearly anything because it is told that nothing will matter if the enemy succeeds. Yet this logic can justify endless sacrifice. There will always be another threat, another rival, another extremist group, another weapons program, another strategic region. If the existence of danger is enough to suspend ordinary priorities will never return. The price of fear is therefore not limited to money. It is paid in attention, trust, constitutional restraint, social solidarity, time, possibility. The greatest cost may be the future a nation fails to build because it remains permanently mobilized against catastrophe. What America cannot see. The title of this inquiry promises that Spinoza can help reveal something America cannot see. But there is no single hidden document, no secret room where the entire truth is stored, no individual controlling every event. What America cannot see is not one conspiracy. It is a pattern, a chain of causes that becomes difficult to recognize because each individual step appears reasonable. Iran represents a danger. Military planners prepare a response. The president acts. Iran retaliates. America responds again. Congress hesitates because troops are already engaged. Media organizations emphasize threats. The public becomes afraid. Critics are accused of weakness. Executive authority expands. Costs rise. Support falls. Yet withdrawal becomes politically more difficult because so much has already been sacrificed. No single step necessarily proves malicious intent. Together, they create a structure that sustains war. The first thing America cannot see is that fear does not merely result from conflict. Fear can become one of conflict's causes. An attack produces fear. Fear produces demands for retaliation. Retaliation produces another attack. Each side experiences itself as responding. Neither experiences itself as initiating the cycle. The war appears to possess an independent life. But the life of the war is composed of human reactions. To interrupt the cycle, someone must act without allowing fear to dictate the response. This does not mean refusing all retaliation. It means choosing action according to a defined objective rather than emotional necessity. The second thing America cannot see is that emergency power wants to survive. Political power rarely returns itself voluntarily. An authority created for a crisis develops defenders. Agencies adapt, budgets expand, procedures change, legal arguments are written. The new authority becomes part of institutional memory. When the original emergency ends, another justification can be found. This does not require cynical intent. Officials may sincerely believe the power remains useful. That is precisely the problem. Useful power is the hardest power to surrender. The third thing America cannot see is that external enemies can organize domestic politics. A divided country may briefly unite against a foreign threat. A struggling administration may redirect attention. Political leaders can present themselves as national protectors rather than partisan actors. Economic, social, and institutional failures can be reinterpreted through war. Rising prices become the enemy's fault. Criticism becomes a national security issue. Political opposition becomes dangerous division. The foreign threat does not need to be invented for this mechanism to operate. A real enemy can be politically useful. The fourth thing America cannot see is that freedom is rarely lost in one dramatic act. There may be no single morning when citizens wake and discover that democracy has vanished. Instead, they accept exceptions. One surveillance measure because the threat is urgent. One unauthorized military action because time is limited. One restriction on information because operations are sensitive. One attack on dissent because unity is necessary. One transfer of power because the president must act decisively. Each step appears temporary. Each possesses a plausible justification. Together, they change the political order. Citizens often imagine tyranny as a visible force imposed from outside. Spinoza teaches us to recognize a subtler danger. People can participate in their own unfreedom. They can demand the powers that later constrain them. They can celebrate the silencing of opponents. They can excuse abuses because they trust the current leader. They can become emotionally invested in the very institutions that reduce their agency. The fifth thing America cannot see is that military dominance does not guarantee political control. The United States may possess superior weapons, intelligence, and logistical capacity. But war is not decided only by destruction. A weaker enemy can survive. It can provoke. It can wait. It can exploit political division. It can impose economic costs. It can transform civilian casualties into recruitment. It can make victory too expensive to define. A powerful nation may therefore win every direct military confrontation while losing control of the political outcome. This is especially true when the objective is unclear. Is the goal to destroy specific military capabilities? Prevent a nuclear weapon? Change Iranian behavior? Remove the government? Protect shipping? Defend allies? Punish attacks? Force negotiations? Each objective requires a different strategy. If the objective changes whenever the previous one becomes difficult, success becomes impossible to measure. War continues because the goal moves. The sixth thing America cannot see is that its internal division is not separate from foreign policy. Every international conflict enters a domestic landscape already shaped by distrust. One side assumes Trump is lying because it distrusts him. Another assumes criticism is sabotage because it distrusts his opponents. Facts are filtered through partisan identity. This makes democratic correction more difficult. Even legitimate criticism can be dismissed as political hatred. Even legitimate security warnings can be dismissed as propaganda. A country unable to create shared standards of evidence cannot make wise decisions about war. The seventh thing America cannot see is that fear changes the meaning of patriotism. Patriotism once meant commitment to the principles and welfare of the country. Under fear, it can become obedience to government action. The flag, military, and president are fused into one symbol. To question one appears to insult all. But a republic depends on a more demanding patriotism. A patriot must be willing to question leaders precisely because the consequences belong to the country. He must defend the Constitution when doing so is unpopular. He must distinguish support for soldiers from support for policy. He must care about foreign civilians without abandoning concern for American security. He must resist the emotional comfort of simple enemies. This form of patriotism is harder to perform. It does not produce immediate applause. It may be attacked by both sides, but it is closer to the freedom Spinoza defended. The final thing America cannot see is that the deepest danger may not be defeat. It may be transformation. A nation can win a war and become more secretive, more centralized, more fearful, more divided, more economically strained, more willing to accept executive authority. It can preserve its borders while losing its political character. The enemy may fail to destroy America. America may still damage itself through the methods it chooses to fight the enemy. This is not pacifism. It is strategic self-knowledge. A society must judge every defense by what it preserves. If the method of protection destroys the value being protected, the strategy has contradicted itself. America believes it is debating whether to continue a war. Beneath that debate lies another question. Has fear already changed what Americans believe freedom requires? Do they now believe freedom requires permanent military readiness, permanent secrecy, permanent executive flexibility, permanent enemies, permanent suspicion? If so, then fear has achieved something no foreign army could accomplish alone. It has entered the nation's definition of itself. Spinoza's alternative. From fear to reason. Spinoza does not offer a world without danger. He does not imagine that rational people will never disagree. He does not promise that understanding will eliminate conflict. He knows human beings are emotional creatures. They desire recognition. They fear loss. They become angry. They imitate one another. They seek belonging. They interpret events according to limited experience. A political philosophy that ignores these facts will fail. Spinoza's alternative is therefore not the elimination of emotion. It is the transformation of passive emotion into greater understanding and collective power. Fear makes people reactive. Reason makes them capable of acting from an understanding of causes. Applied to the Iran war, this transformation would begin with clear objectives. The government must state what it seeks to achieve, not merely in moral language, not peace through strength, not the defeat of terror, not the protection of freedom. These phrases may inspire, but they cannot guide strategy. A real objective must be specific enough to evaluate. What military capability must be removed? What agreement would end the conflict? What conditions would permit withdrawal? What outcome is considered acceptable? What risks are unacceptable? What evidence would show that escalation has failed? Without defined objectives, every action can be justified, and no failure can be recognized. The second requirement is public accountability. Some military information must remain secret. Operational details cannot always be broadcast, but secrecy must be limited. The government must provide sufficient evidence for citizens and legislators to judge the purpose, legality, and likely consequences of the war. Classified intelligence cannot become a sacred object. American history contains too many examples of uncertain or misleading claims used to justify military action. Skepticism is not betrayal. It is institutional memory. The third requirement is genuine congressional authority. Congress cannot wait until a conflict becomes unpopular and then issue symbolic objections. It must reclaim responsibility before and during military action. Legislators must vote openly. They must explain their decisions. They must define limits. They must accept political accountability for both action and restraint. A president should not be permitted to carry the entire burden of war, but neither should Congress be permitted to hide behind him. The fourth requirement is the protection of dissent. A society cannot correct mistakes if citizens fear questioning leaders. Military personnel, diplomats, analysts, journalists, religious communities, and ordinary voters must be able to challenge policy without being described as allies of the enemy. This does not mean every criticism is wise. Some opposition will be partisan. Some claims will be false. Some speakers will minimize genuine danger. The answer is more argument, stronger evidence, and clearer reasoning, not the moral exclusion of dissent. Spinoza defended freedom of thought because peace created through intellectual repression is unstable. People cannot be forced to believe. They may become silent. They may outwardly obey, but inward resentment grows. A state that attempts to control judgment creates hypocrisy and hostility. The fifth requirement is separation between faith and state power. Religious citizens should bring moral conviction into public life, but government policy must remain open to reasons that all citizens can examine. A president cannot justify war by divine purpose. A pastor cannot convert political loyalty into a test of salvation. A nation cannot assume that its power proves its righteousness. Faith should remind political authority of its limits. It should not free authority from judgment. The sixth requirement is understanding the enemy as a causal system. This means studying Iran's internal divisions, incentives, fears, and strategic calculations. It means distinguishing the regime from the population. It means identifying which actions strengthen hardliners and which create opportunities for diplomacy. It means recognizing that humiliation may produce resistance rather than surrender. It means considering how American behavior appears from the other side, without accepting the other side's entire narrative. Empathy is not agreement. Perspective is not capitulation. Understanding an enemy's motives is a form of strategic intelligence. The seventh requirement is proportion. Not every danger justifies every response. The existence of a threat does not prove that war is the best method of addressing it. Leaders must compare the danger of action, the danger of inaction, the danger of escalation, the danger of restraint, the short-term result, the long-term effect, the military objective, the political consequences. Fear isolates one risk and magnifies it until all alternatives disappear. Reason places risks in relationship. The eighth requirement is patience. This may be the most difficult. Modern politics rewards immediate action. The public wants evidence that leaders are doing something. Military force creates visible action. Diplomacy often occurs slowly and privately. Its successes may look like nothing happened. A missile launch produces dramatic images. A successful negotiation may prevent an event that no one ever sees. This creates a bias toward violence. The visible response appears stronger than the invisible prevention. Reason must resist this bias. Sometimes patience is weakness. Sometimes delay increases danger. But sometimes the refusal to react immediately is the highest form of control. A leader who cannot tolerate delay may be governed by the enemy's provocations. A nation unable to endure uncertainty will repeatedly choose action for emotional relief. The ninth requirement is civic education. Citizens cannot evaluate foreign policy if they understand politics only as entertainment. They need historical knowledge, media literacy, awareness of constitutional authority, the ability to distinguish probability from certainty, the discipline to examine claims from sources they dislike. Democracy assumes capacities that must be cultivated. Without them, elections become competitions between emotional narratives. The 10th requirement is a different understanding of strength. Strength is not the inability to retreat. It is the ability to change course when evidence changes. Strength is not the refusal to negotiate. It is the confidence to negotiate without surrendering essential interests. Strength is not making others fear you. It is remaining capable of reason when others attempt to provoke you. Strength is not silencing critics. It is answering them. Strength is not expanding power because one can. It is accepting limits because no person should be trusted without them. This is where Spinoza's philosophy becomes radically demanding. He does not ask whether America can destroy its enemies. He asks whether America can understand its own emotions. Can the nation recognize when fear is useful and when it is manipulative? Can citizens admit that their political side may be wrong? Can leaders distinguish national interest from personal pride? Can Congress accept responsibility rather than merely criticize? Can religious communities defend moral truth without becoming instruments of political power? Can media organizations report danger without transforming anxiety into a business model? Can a powerful country respond to violence without becoming dependent on violence? These are not abstract questions. They determine whether the United States remains a republic in more than name. Freedom is not the absence of danger. No political order can provide that. Freedom is the ability to confront danger without surrendering reason. It is the capacity to act without becoming the passive instrument of fear. It is the power to understand causes, choose proportionate responses, and preserve the institutions that make correction possible. A nation guided by reason may still fight, but it will know why. It will define the objective. It will limit authority. It will examine consequences. It will remain open to peace. It will not need hatred to sustain unity. It will not call every doubt betrayal. It will not transform emergency into identity. This is not weakness. It is the most difficult strength a democracy can possess. A nation ruled by fear cannot remain free. Iran is not an imaginary country. Its weapons are not philosophical symbols. Its government can make dangerous choices. American troops and allies face real risks. The world does not become safe merely because citizens reject propaganda. Spinoza would never require us to deny reality in the name of peace. He would require us to understand reality more adequately. That means recognizing threats without allowing threats to control every judgment. It means acknowledging the failures of Iran without treating every Iranian as an enemy. It means examining Trump's decisions without imagining that he alone created the system. It means defending America without confusing defense with permanent war. The central question is not whether fear belongs in politics. Fear is inevitable. Citizens fear attack. Leaders fear failure. Soldiers fear death. Families fear loss. Nations fear humiliation. The question is what political power does with fear. Does it help people understand the danger? Or does it magnify danger to expand authority? Does it provide evidence? Or does it demand trust? Does it protect constitutional debate? Or does it present debate as weakness? Does it seek a defined peace? Or does it require a permanent enemy? A government may insist that every action is taken for security, but security achieved through continuous fear is unstable. A population living in permanent emergency becomes easier to divide, easier to manipulate, easier to exhaust. It may continue voting. It may continue speaking. It may continue celebrating freedom. Yet its political imagination grows narrower. It becomes unable to picture safety without domination, patriotism without obedience, strength without violence, faith without political control, government without fear. This is what Spinoza helps us see. Freedom is not merely a legal status. It is a condition of the mind. A person dominated by fear cannot fully understand his own choices. A nation dominated by fear may still appear powerful, while losing the capacity to direct itself. America may defeat military targets. It may damage Iran's capabilities. It may force concessions. It may demonstrate overwhelming power. But none of these achievements can answer the deepest question. What will America become through the process? Will presidential power be more limited or less? Will Congress become more responsible or more passive? Will citizens become more informed or more dependent on partisan narratives? Will religious language encourage moral restraint or sacred warfare? Will public fear decline, or will the next enemy simply replace the current one? The greatest danger facing America may not be that it fails to defeat its enemies. It may be that, in fighting them, it becomes unable to recognize what freedom once meant. A free nation does not prove its freedom by insisting that it can do whatever it wants. It proves its freedom by understanding why it acts. It does not measure strength by the number of weapons it can launch. It measures strength by the emotions it can master. It does not silence those who question war. It listens, argues, and answers. It does not give rulers unlimited trust. It gives them laws, boundaries, and accountability. It does not need to believe that every enemy is evil in order to resist real aggression. It does not need to imagine itself perfect in order to defend what is valuable. The politics of fear offers a simple promise: obey, and you will be safe. History offers a harsher truth. Obedience may produce temporary order. It cannot produce freedom. Fear can mobilize a population. It cannot teach that population where it should go. It can begin wars. It cannot define peace. It can create loyalty. It cannot create understanding. It can place extraordinary power in the hands of a leader. It cannot guarantee that the power will be used wisely. This is why Spinoza's warning remains urgent nearly 4 centuries after he wrote. Human beings who move constantly between hope and fear become vulnerable to anyone who offers certainty. Political and religious authorities can exploit that uncertainty. They can transform anxiety into superstition, superstition into obedience, and obedience into power. But the same human beings possess another capacity. They can understand. They can investigate causes. They can question images. They can resist emotional manipulation. They can build institutions that restrain ambition. They can protect disagreement. They can choose not merely between attack and surrender, but among many forms of intelligent action. They can refuse the lie that reason is weakness. America now stands before that choice. Not simply the choice between war and peace, not simply the choice between Trump and his opponents, not simply the choice between supporting or condemning Iran. The deeper choice is between 2 forms of political life. One is organized by fear. In that society, every crisis expands power. Every enemy justifies obedience. Every doubt threatens unity. Every war prepares the next. The other is guided, however imperfectly, by reason. In that society, danger is examined rather than worshipped. Power is limited even when leaders claim necessity. Citizens remain participants rather than spectators. Faith does not become a weapon of the state. War remains an accountable political decision rather than an unquestionable sacred mission. The choice will not be made once. It will be made every day. In Congress, in churches, in newsrooms, on social media, at dinner tables, inside the private mind of every citizen who encounters a frightening claim and must decide whether to react or understand. Fear demands obedience. Reason demands understanding, and only one of them can sustain a free republic. So the final question is not whether America has enemies. Every powerful nation has enemies. The final question is whether America will allow those enemies to determine what kind of nation it becomes. Will fear define patriotism? Will emergency define government? Will war define strength? Or will Americans insist that the country they defend must remain worthy of defense? Spinoza cannot answer that question for America. He can only reveal the danger. The answer belongs to the people. Do you believe the United States is now acting from reason or from fear? Should one president possess the power to continue a war without clear and continuing authorization from Congress? And when a government asks citizens to sacrifice freedom for security, who decides when the sacrifice has become too great? Leave your answer in the comments, because the future of this war may be determined by missiles, negotiations, and political power. But the future of American freedom will be determined by whether its citizens still possess the courage to think.